Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. In this episode, we have a conversation with Sally Steele. Sally is the co-executive director of City Hope San Francisco. City Hope is a nonprofit focused on providing a space of belonging for our most marginalized neighbors. We have a really good conversation about belonging as the beloved and engaging with others in a way that provides dignity and hope. It's a really good conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it, so let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Sally Steele. Sally, welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast. I'm so excited that you're here today. It's going to be a good conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited and looking forward to it as well.
Yeah. Well, where are you right now?
So I am in Oakland, California, in my house, probably like a lot of people working from home. So I'm out here.
Really I know that people can't see anything at the moment, but I really like that painting behind you, or that picture behind you on the wall. What is that? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, so it's I guess what we would call activist art. So there's I can't remember which organization we got it from, but it's kind of been floating around that image, and then similarly painted images. That one is of a young woman, African American woman with dreadlocks. She's wearing a red shirt, and it says "We the People" at the bottom.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, really art that just kind of encapsulates like the moment of who is America and
Right.
who are we as people and how do we show up for one another.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it. I think it's great. So, what does it look like to be true, authentic community in a space that is full of diversity, full of different faiths and different viewpoints? And how do we enter into a space with diverse views and come and see each other for who we really are?
That is a good and big, big
Huge, isn't
question.
it?
And I think you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask, and kind of just where people are situated in our current environment, right?
Yeah.
So I think for those who've been historically disenfranchised, this has been a moment where there is both the hope of a national conversation around oppression, around systemic racism, around injustice, kind of writ large, but then also in its historical context.
Yep.
I think for some other folks, the conversation is new. And so they'll maybe enter in a little bit of a different way. And then I think for other folks, it's not just new, but frightening. And
Right.
so I think that there's different people entering that conversation in different ways. And I think ultimately, when I think about community, I think of belonging and creating spaces of belonging.
Mm.
And so how do we widen the circle of who belongs and who gets
Yeah.
to decide that? And, we could obviously get into structural things. We could get into issues of power because those things can't be ignored.
Yep.
And at the same time, a lot of this plays out face-to-face, one-on-one with individuals within your church, within your faith community, within your workspace, at the grocery store,
Right.
just kind of anywhere where you interact with a person, especially now that the country's reopening, right? And there's going to be
Yep.
more of those interactions, not behind a screen, but face to face. And so how do we interact with one another, and how do we build community? How do we make space for people who are different from ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
wherever we are physically? And then also within our spheres of power, however small or large those are, how do we create space for people there as well? For people not to just exist and be tolerated, but for people to really thrive and succeed and have equity. So it goes from like the micro
Yep.
in terms of our interactions to a much broader conversation
Oh, yeah.
around, what are we doing for each other when it comes to policy?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, the things that have really helped me is I think a lot of the issues that we face they're worldview issues of, what is really deep deep inside of us that comes out, and we see the world differently. So there's all clashing worldviews. But I think even a worldview, what it is for me is our identity. Who do we truly see ourselves as? So for me, I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm a beloved son of God. If I see my identity as that, I'm beloved, and I could go, well, God created everyone as beloved sons and daughters, that he loves them, he sees them, he knows them. It actually starts to change my thinking and my posture towards other people, because we're looking at really the same family members from, which look, they may look different, they think different, they act different, but they're the same family members that really are loved by the Father. And that's helped me a lot. Is there something that's helped you in that space to interact with others?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love what you said about being primarily beloved. I heard a pastor once talk about how we're here to be loved, not to be useful,
Hmm.
and how our culture has kind of turned our attention away from who are we as just beloved members of a community versus who are we as contributors, and what happens when you stop
Yeah.
contributing. So for me, I think that same framework is actually really helpful. And I think kind of knowing, another thing that's helped me is kind of acknowledging my own lens
Mm-hmm.
and not seeing it as neutral. So I think sometimes we enter into spaces, and even if we've gotten to the place where we acknowledge the image of God in all people, or at least in theory do, right?
Right.
Or we, see that other people are just people also, there is still this thing of, I'm the norm, the neutral. They're different
Right.
from me, and their
Yep.
differences are okay, but I'm like the norm that I'm hoping people will assimilate into. And I
Right.
think an important step for all of us, because we're all like the protagonists in our own stories, and so
Correct.
we kind
Yeah.
of center ourselves. It's a very human thing, but for all of us to step back and realize that everyone is the center of their own story in a lot of ways, and that their own the identities, the history, the narratives that we bring to the table actually aren't neutral, and
Yep.
that they're debatable. And some of the things we believe aren't shared by others, and some things can be held a little more loosely than how we hold them. To realize that none of us were raised in a vacuum, right? Like we're
Right.
all the product of our broader society, our families, our friend circles, um, everything that impacted us, the media we listened to, the music, the like everything. We're people who constantly get rewired. And so
Yeah.
it's just like when we talk about like the liturgies of church that shape you, well, there's liturgies everywhere. Like there's
Yep.
liturgy in sports, and there's liturgies in different communities, and those will shape you. So even having some idea of how you've been shaped, and being open to the fact that other people have been equally
Mm.
shaped, and that um, the way they've been shaped isn't less than yours, it's just different. And so maybe
Right.
even reassessing our definition of what different is, and whether it's different in relation to me, or whether you yourself see that, or whether you see yourself as different also. Does that make sense? It's just this
Yeah.
idea of, we all bring um, our history and ourselves, our generational history, all of that to every conversation. And so once you start seeing that
Mm-hmm.
reality, that we're all so complex, and that we're all different from each other, but we're not all striving towards any one individual's
Right.
norm or any one culture's norm, right?
Yep.
Like what does it mean to step away from assimilation towards any one particular human culture, and rather assimilation towards God's reality, and the
Mm.
idea of the kingdom as a place that's filled with love and grace and room for everybody?
Yeah.
And that's a big shift.
Mm. It's a huge shift. We also can't go into any conversation assuming that people's definitions are the same. So whenever we mention something, I have one definition, and then you would have a different definition. But if I go in assuming that it's the same, we're gonna miss each other. We're not gonna be able to interact on a deep level. It's still gonna be a surface level. What are some good ways that we can not assume, and maybe ask some questions and figure out what people mean?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think shared language is huge, and always being open to other people's interpretations of what something is and what something isn't. And so I think asking the question, stating what you mean as clearly as possible. If you're like in a structured conversation, then being able to say like, when I say power, I mean this, or when I say
Yeah.
racism, I mean this, and I don't mean that. And then just using, I would say also using language that's not, I guess, exclusive or extreme. And by that, I mean like, absolute language, like, well, never this or
Right.
always that, and it happens in little tiny things. I remember when my husband and I first got married, like he was using, a knife for something. And I was like, oh, you can't use that knife for that. That's not a butter knife. And he's like, it is a butter knife. And I was like, no, a butter knife is this. And he goes, no, this is a butter knife. And it's just like the dumbest thing, right? The first year of marriage kind of debate. It's just like, oh, wait, like just because my household called this particular knife a butter knife and his called that one doesn't change the knife, and you can use it for whatever you want to.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
But, it turns into like a thing. And so I know that's like kind of a silly example, but it just makes me think, just as humans, we create these categories and we're so sure because that's all we've ever seen.
Right.
So why would it be something else?
Yep.
And so you extrapolate from that silly example to something much bigger and more serious where, you're talking about race, for instance, which is very heavy conversation. It's very personal.
Yep.
It tends to get fraught quickly, and people get super anxious about it. People get hurt really easily. And to be able to lay out and say, hey, when I say racism, I mean this. And when I say race, I mean that other thing.
Yeah.
And so just being able to be open with it, and then honestly be really open also to admitting when you're wrong, and being open to apologizing and saying, my intent was not that, but I realized the impact it had on you was this, and I apologize.
Yeah.
And then you're able to move on. And I've apologized myself for things I've said that I've realized are insensitive. Less around like race, but even around issues of like gender, where I just didn't realize that something I said was offensive or just hurtful. And to not try to justify it and fix it, but to rather be like, oh yeah, that was hurtful. Yeah. That was my impact. I'm sorry.
Yep.
And then try to mend the relationship.
Yeah. Where did you, what was your journey like to get to City Hope where you are now? How did you get there? What did it look like?
The meandering path of God, never quite straight. So, I studied something completely different in undergrad. I was sure I was going to go into kind of more government work, international work. And it just felt like the doors just kind of kept shutting when it came to like getting clearance for jobs or kind of getting to an opportunity that felt right. And so I actually ended up working in refugee resettlement at a nonprofit in Atlanta. And so starting to do a little bit of like faith work. And my job there was really helping churches understand who is a refugee, who are refugees. How can churches help? How can churches engage? What things aren't helpful? And in that process, I realized how much I enjoyed working with faith communities, and also helping to kind of just shepherd people through a process and helping them create those spaces of belonging, and helping them and myself kind of broaden my view of like who are our neighbors, and who do we welcome in, and how do we do that, and what's this like myth of the deserving poor that a lot of people have like latched onto kind of unconsciously. And so kind of started unpacking all of that, and ended up from there actually doing a pre-seminary internship, a year-long internship at a church there in Atlanta. And that's kind of where I kind of got on the path of more like church leadership, and then it turned into like nonprofit leadership as well. So I did that for a year, and then I worked at a nonprofit in San Francisco doing kind of board management while I applied for seminary. And then so then it ended up in seminary, just not at all where I ever honestly thought I was going to end up. But I did my MDiv, and I really enjoyed kind of understanding more about the why of my own faith, of the why of moving into justice spaces, of articulating God's creation in a different way, of making room for people, including room for myself, right? Like as a woman of color, church has not always been the most welcoming space. And so, what does it look like to be fully free and fully accepted as a child of God? And that acceptance first starts with yourself, and then realizing I'd always known that I was accepted by God, but I had trouble with like the church piece of it. And so kind of starting to shape that and understand what that looked like. So from there, after seminary, I ended up leading local outreach at a church in Washington, D.C. I did that for a few years. And that was really like finding local nonprofit partners and sending volunteers, doing grants. And I really enjoyed that work. Again, I was saying, how are we called to respond to the needs in our community? How do we walk alongside people in a way that's empowering and dignifying? How do we, again, make space in our community? And then ended up moving to the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in Oakland, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I work in San Francisco. And so I reached out to City Hope when I first moved here, and I was just basically putting out feelers, and turned out they were hiring, and they were looking to open a community center for our unhoused neighbors, and they needed someone to kind of help lead that up. And my co-director, Paul Trudeau, was already leading it. He had been there for a number of years and had really started the ministry. And so I was able to come alongside and partner with him. And it's just been quite a journey, just from opening the community center. We do events for, again, our unhoused neighbors or those who are very low income or unstably housed. And it's meals, but really it's relationship. It's finding places or creating spaces for people to gather and connect with their neighbors. We do bingo and games and karaoke, and just let people have a space where they can just literally put their stuff down, put down some of their burdens, and just enjoy themselves in a familiar, trusting place for a couple hours every night. So we do that. We host AA meetings. We do grocery deliveries to our elderly disabled neighbors in the neighborhood. We also run a transitional sober living home. So it's a wonderful organization, really impacting one specific neighborhood in San Francisco, and we're in the northwest corner of an area called the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which is really a hub of social service. And there's just a lot of joy and gifts, and a ton of poverty and drug use and homelessness in that one particular area. So we're just there to be a support to our neighbors. And my role in particular is, as the co-executive director, is partly like just the finance operations, and then also our staff development, our equity work, kind of that creating of spaces for our internal team too, of how do we help each other feel supported? How do we have an equitable, everything from like hiring practices to actual space of belonging for people who work there too. So it's been great. And for partners and organizations that come through, there's a lot of pieces. We're a small organization, so we all have 5 hats. So ask anyone on our team, like, what do we do? And they're like, let me tell you.
I know what that's like. My wife and I always think, as executive directors of a missions organization, we also always think of ourselves as utility players. It seems like we're always, doing this or that, and, not just our own job, but everybody on our staff is like that, right? We're all wearing different hats, and we're just all getting it done.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's good. One of the things you said, you wanted to impact one specific neighborhood, and one specific place. What's the role of incarnation, of really just being rooted in a place and not trying to go, too broad?
Right. Yeah, I think proximity and presence would be the two words that come to mind. And proximity is something that I know Brian Stevenson, who folks probably know,
Yep.
who wrote Just Mercy and is a lawyer who's done a lot around incarceration and especially around African Americans on death row and anti-lynching projects, and even just bringing the history to bear. Just he talks about the importance of being proximate, of being close to people in order to build empathy and to understand where someone's coming from. So part
Yeah.
of the incarnation is being close to people. I mean, when we think about Jesus and how many people, even with his disciples, who tried to kind of create a little bit of a shield around him, like the number of people he let
Right.
touch him
Yeah.
and be really close to him in ways that, especially in that time, were often seen as inappropriate.
Yep.
But the being close to people was a large part of his mission. He went from place to place. He connected with people. He had people who followed him, but he was also close to and constantly seeking out those who society had put on the margins, and even those who the Jewish people themselves had put on the margins for good reasons, right? Like the tax collectors and people who were also playing an oppressive force. And yet he pulled people to himself with grace and truth. So I think for us, a lot of it is just being proximate, being close to people, and people can tell when you don't want that, right? Like when you don't want to be near them, like when you skirt around them, whether you're disgusted or whether you're afraid or whatever the case may be. People can sense that. Like we can all sense that when we feel unwanted, and so that proximity is part of it. And then the presence piece, I would say, is a consistency of being in the same place over a period of years, and for people to know, like, oh, you're not going anywhere. Like one of the things I do as part of my role is actually we have a partnership with the San Francisco County Jail. And, I've gone in for a number of years and met with the same woman, and we've become close. But it was really about 2 years in that she really opened up. And I remember her saying like, oh, I just didn't know if you'd keep coming back.
Yeah.
And there's something about somebody knowing that you're there for the long haul and that you're not going to disappear that builds trust also. So I think that's part of how we impact. And I actually think that presence as an organization, like obviously not all our staff are like frontline program people, but as an organization, sustaining a presence in that space requires a full team effort. And I think it's really important that we've been consistent, a known entity, a place of trust and support for a number of years there. And people come to you with more things once they trust you. And then you need to continue to earn that trust, right? Not take it for granted, but realize that it really is a relationship and not something to be something that does need to be treasured and maintained.
Yeah. I mean, in Kansas City, some of the things that I've seen is, especially of people trying to visit refugees, new immigrants into the city, a lot of times they're there for a short time with this family. They are forming relationship, but then leaving because they may have some ulterior motive. They may just say, oh, they're not really open to Jesus. I don't want to keep visiting them. But it actually does some damage to the the refugee or the immigrant that's coming through in that family, where, wow, I thought you were here with me, but then they leave. They're not there. How did you see? I mean, even in your time in Atlanta, as you're bringing in churches and communities to do some refugee resettlement, how have you seen that done well? And what are some of the processes that we need to implement so that we can show love, but just really just be love to the people that are coming that are brand new?
Yeah. Well, I think this goes back a little bit to what we were saying earlier about being beloved, and then also seeing everybody else as the beloved.
Mm-hmm.
So if your interest in interacting with somebody is the usefulness, and by that I mean um, I want to see how many people I can save, and
Right.
I want to see if they're receptive. And if they're not going to help me get to like some numerical goal I have,
Right.
either implied or explicit, then they're not worth my time.
Yeah.
And that is a really hurtful, and I would say even dangerous mindset, because it really is so dehumanizing, of saying this person's worth is only tied to this other external goal I have, as opposed to saying, this person is made in the image of God,
Mm-hmm.
and their worth is not something to be calculated or disputed. It just is.
Yep.
And it's not more or less than mine. And they don't need to do anything to deserve it. And it also assumes that we don't have something to learn about somebody else's faith journey,
Yep.
and their own faith beliefs, which is also not in the spirit of humility that I think as Christians we should hold. So some of the things I've seen go well have been when people have been really humble, when people have been thoughtful about what they were engaging into and kind of managed their own expectations. And so, that looks like realizing that you're coming alongside a refugee family or an immigrant family. You're not adopting them.
Yeah.
They have their own histories, they have their own skill sets, they have their own goals and desires for their own lives. They also, presumably by virtue of their journey, have traumas. I mean, we all have traumas, but, trauma specific to having
Yeah.
to flee
Mm-hmm.
your home country, and I'm assuming leaving family and friends for most people. So there's just a lot that people are already carrying, and how do we come alongside in order to lighten that burden, to
Yeah.
be a support in the way that they want to be supported, as opposed to in the way that we want to support.
Yeah.
And what it makes me think of, to just put it in some more familiar perspective, is like when your child wants to help you cook and you're like, oh great, can you wash the dishes as I do this? Like, can you help clean up after this? Or can you wipe down the counter? Oh no, I really just wanted to chop the carrot. And it's like, but I don't need you to do that because I can do that faster, but I need you to help in this way. You're like, oh no, but that's, and then you realize, like, you don't want to help me. You have this task that you've already decided you want to do. And you just want my permission to do that task. And I think sometimes we approach helping the community in the same way. Like, we've predetermined what we think would be most helpful and what we would enjoy the most. And that's really the only thing we're going to do. And so that is actually not helpful. And it's really not service either, right? It's something you're doing for yourself. And so then you need to kind of step back and ask yourself why. Why are you present there? What is it you're trying to do? And is it advancing God's kingdom? Is it advancing faith, hope, and love?
Yeah.
Or is it serving yourself in some way? So I've seen it go well when people put themselves in perspective of God's kingdom, and when they view the other person as truly fully human, fully made in the image of God, an adult capable of making their own choices, and see themselves as a partner as opposed to a parent. And then I've seen it not go well when people kind of take it in the other direction and want to micromanage somebody's life. And I've had churches say things to me like, oh, but we gave them that money, and so we really think they should use it this way.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, that wasn't the agreement. The agreement was that, you help them pay rent, not that you would tell them where to live.
Yeah.
Right. And so taking away a family's agency because you somehow think that they're not capable is not appropriate at best.
Yeah.
And not helpful, right? Because then the next person who remotely reminds somebody of that person, whether it's because they come from a faith community or for some other reason, comes along to help, they're less likely to accept that assistance.
Yeah. I see agency is really, really key, my wife and I were in the Middle East for 5 years working with Syrian refugees, and we were in people's homes, refugee homes, all the time. One of the things I saw do well in the refugee camp that's near the city that we lived, 140,000 refugees in this camp, but they built grocery stores and just gave people coupons to go shop for themselves instead of coming to the back of a truck and throwing rice at the family. It, it helped provide some dignity in the midst of a traumatic and horrible, hard, difficult situation. It was just one small step, but I think, as giving somebody agency just to go in and say, this is what I want to eat, and this is what my family wants to eat, and this is what I'm going to choose, and I'm going to bring it home and be able to cook for my family. It really helped really make the process of them entering back into a society quicker, because they had a little bit of dignity at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I've seen some organizations start to make that shift even with their Christmas stores in terms of, not playing Santa and handing out gifts to children in need, but rather letting the parents have the dignity of shopping and surprising their own child. And then at City Hope, I mean, that dignity of choice is huge. So when I said we do meals, we actually have, we had to pivot a little bit during COVID, but we're starting to repivot back to, our dining space is actually round tables, and people come in and they actually get a menu and they get to select. It's a limited menu. It's not like 5 pages, but they get to select their salad dressing. And do you want cheese? And, which of the 2 entrees do you want? And the idea is like, no, we're not going to feed as many people as possible that way, because it's going to slow people down. But if our goal is not number of meals served, but rather relationships built and dignity affirmed, then that's one of the ways we do that, by saying you get to choose what you put in your body, because just like me, I want that choice, and I want to be able to make those decisions. I see that you also are equally entitled to that right, that choice for your own self. And so here's a menu. And so, it really is a different model. And yes, it's slower, and some would say less efficient, but again, is usefulness and efficiency our goal, or is acknowledging someone's belovedness, right? We come back to that.
Yeah. So then how do you get to, as an organization, go from number goals to process goals? Like, this is how we want to interact, and this is what we want to do. So eventually whatever number will come. How do you get to, do you have process goals instead of numerical goals? What does that look like?
Yeah. So our goals are a lot harder to to quantify sometimes because of that. And it is a mental shift and a cultural shift, right? Because, then it comes time to print out your annual report, and people want to know how many meals you served and all these different things, because those are the numbers they're used to seeing. So it's culture setting for our organization, but it's also a shifting of culture for our partners and our donors, and really a process of discipleship is how we see it. And so for us, part of how we do that, and there's some numbers involved, but we'll say things like, when we train our volunteers or when we talk to our staff, like, everyone who comes in, by the time they leave, they should have heard somebody say their name 3 times. So you say their name when you take their menu, because they write their name at the top of the menu. You say their name when you hand them the food. You say, bye when they leave, and you say their name. So bye, Tom. And you name them, and by doing that, you see them. You introduce yourself. We wear name tags. And we try to personalize it in that sense. We also talk about how we address people and being thoughtful about using the pronouns that they ask us to use, and acknowledging people in their own identities. We do coffee service where we're bringing the coffee out, and we say, do you want sugar? Do you want milk? Oh, you actually want tea? Let me go see if I have any. And it's all those things of saying, it's not about how many cups did we serve, but did we serve Tom the cup he wanted in the way he wanted it? So there's things like that where it's a process in that sense, just in our interaction with our guests, and even that, calling them guests, they're guests within City Hope as opposed to clients. So part of it is that, and then part of it is just internally with our staff, and it's just that setting that cultural expectation where we always respect, or always expect the highest respect, towards our guests and towards each other. And even the way we've written our employee handbook puts the same kind of expectations and requirements on our volunteers and our donors. So just like we expect our staff to be super respectful and welcoming to our guests, if we see a volunteer or a donor acting in a way, and this doesn't really happen, but if we see it, we would also intercede there and say, hey, this is how we communicate with our guests, and this is why. Again, there's that process of discipleship. And so for us, when you ask kind of what processes we put in place, it's really about culture setting and setting the expectation that this is a place where everyone is welcome, respected, and celebrated. Like, those are our three things. And if you're not doing that, then you're not creating that safe space of belonging, which is who we are.
Yeah.
And so we keep coming back to our values. And so, we don't want to keep people waiting all night for their meal or anything. It's not about going as slow as possible, but also not rushing it so that, they get the wrong order. And then you're like, well, just eat it. Like, we would never do that. That's because that's not who we are. And so our staff knows who we are. Our volunteers know who we are. Our clients know who we are.
Yeah.
And that being instead of doing is just really important to us.
Yeah. Being is so important. And when I've been working with others, especially, in the Middle East, the Syrians have a saying. They say, "Sarbena hubzumilla," after we've eaten together. It basically just says, between us has happened bread and salt. And it means we're now friends. We can interact on a deeper level because we shared a meal. And I think, sharing meals, eating together will provide some depth of relationship that just a service can't do. And even, as you are calling people guests and you're calling people by name, it is a slowing down and sharing together more than service to. What's the interaction of that, and what have you seen in any shared meals that you've had in your life with others, and the experience that you've had in that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's just something vulnerable, maybe. I don't know. It sounds a little silly because like we all eat, but maybe like that's the point, right? Like, we all need to eat. And the fact that, like, one of the things we say at City Hope is that we would never serve food that we wouldn't eat ourselves. It's actually really good food. Like, we have a great chef and he makes really good food. And we kind of all want to stay and eat because it's really good. Right. And so it's this idea of, you're our guest and we're giving you our best. And I'm going to sit down and eat with you. And we know we don't always get the opportunity to do that, right? Like, as staff, you're like walking around and doing things, and I don't run programs. And so I'm not even there that often, but our team is there. And I know that I'm thinking of some people in particular who have really taken the time to like build that relationship by being present, by listening, by being open, by sharing a meal, by providing the best food possible. And I know for myself, like, some of my deepest interactions in terms of connecting with the actual community have been when I've, shared a dessert, because usually that's the only time I end up like sitting down or being like close by, but sharing dessert, or if someone, asked for tea. Like, I'm a tea drinker personally. I don't drink coffee. So I'm like, me too, and it's just like those little things like that. And then I think also just like in our everyday lives, like whether you host a small group from your church, I know that has been some of the most meaningful relationships I've had have been through really connecting with people. And we always, like you said, start with a meal and we eat together and we share food. And, whether people bring things or we cook and host, there's something about being together in person, and it just feels really intimate. Something about eating together feels like, well, one, depending on what you're serving, like you're sharing your culture, you're sharing your preferences, you're you're engaging in something that in most other times you're really only doing with your family, especially in our society where it's very like smaller settings and fewer extended families living together and fewer community meals. And it really tends to be a really private thing.
Yeah.
And even when you do eat out, it's like you're on private table. There's not very many places where you're eating communally. And so there's something, I would say it's the intimacy. I think that we demonstrate when we sit down together, and we stop doing, right? We stop doing things and fixing things and offering advice, but rather we're just sitting and partaking, and it's such an equalizer. And obviously, like in my mind, it also goes to the communion table, right? Where we're like invited to this feast that we don't deserve, that we didn't help create, that we don't have a right to in some ways, and yet we're invited to and given that right of sorts by being called, siblings of Christ, and being allowed to come to this table and share together. And at my church, we always say, it's not the pastor's table, it's not the elder's table, it's not this particular church's table either. Like, we're not going to tell you who can and cannot come, because it's the Lord's table, and he invites all of his creation to come forward. And there's a beauty in that, and that repetition, really, and that liturgy, and that that mirroring within our daily lives.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My wife has a really good Kenyan friend who did did an MDiv at Fuller Theological Seminary, and she was invited out to eat a lot, but never once was she invited home to somebody's house for a meal. And she was really hurt by that. Like, so even in our Western view, in our mindsets, taking somebody out to eat at a restaurant, a nice meal, is showing hospitality and love. But from her Kenyan worldview, from her culture, that actually doesn't go far enough. She wants to be in somebody's home, share a meal across a family table, to be able to go a little bit deeper. So I think it's definitely very important that we slow down and we eat together, and invite people in and show hospitality in a way that people want, and not the way that we think people want. So yeah, that's really good. Well, I'm going to give you a really broad question, and then we're going to get to a couple of questions at the end. But this broad question is, what are some of the ways that we can establish the kingdom of God in a place or a community? How can we bring heaven to earth as we pray in the Lord's Prayer over again? It's a big, broad question. I know it's a big one. But
tell me more. I think that's a good question, in part because I think so many people want to hear the answer to that, right? Like, we want to know how to do that. We long for it. We long to feel the kingdom of God, and the idea that we can participate in helping it come to fruition feels, I think rightfully so, like an exciting calling. I think the thing to be thoughtful and mindful of is that we're not the only ones with that calling, and that often Jesus is already there. And so what I would say is that first step is maybe to pray for eyes to see and ears to hear, and to walk into a space with a sense of, how is God already moving through here? Maybe the Spirit called me here to be discipled, to watch for his creation, to be in awe of something he's doing that I didn't even know he was doing in a neighborhood that I've never been to. And to really remember, especially as we're new in spaces, And even with the Tenderloin, where, I've been working there for 7 years, but I don't live there. It's not my neighborhood.
Right.
And so I don't walk into that space as though I own it or it's mine in some way, but rather I remember that I'm a guest there in a much broader way than our community is our guests at the center. And so in what ways can I be mindful of the people around me? In what ways can I listen and look and learn and see the movements of the Spirit there, and the ways that God can open my eyes to what is happening around? And I can also speak my truth while I'm there, right? And be a friend, be an encourager. I think less so be a fixer, and more just be someone who comes in to just love your neighbor. And going back to what we said earlier is how do they need to be loved, and how do they want to be loved? It does mean, especially in certain lines of work, creating healthy boundaries. And it doesn't mean like everything's a free for all, but it does mean having some spirit of humility, not going in with answers first, but really one of our values at City Hope is listening well. So how can we listen to our community members and acknowledge that the Spirit is speaking through them often? And maybe we just need to tune our ears in different ways. So I think that would be something that I would encourage people to do, is just walk in with a spirit of humility, with a teachable heart. And that prayer, eyes to see and ears to hear, is can be just really powerful to see things that maybe we didn't even know to look for.
Yeah, to go in with the heart of a learner, to discover what is there. It's a beautiful posture to have, I think, in every sphere that we walk in. What does it look like as your family to be able to do this, engage the community together as a family?
Yeah. I think that different families will do it in different ways. I think there's certainly people who volunteer with their children, who want to expose their children to circumstances that they might not ordinarily walk by. And so I think there is a value to that. I think as long as we always do it thoughtfully, so that it's not instilling like a savior complex or a savior mentality within our children from a young age, but we're rather saying, we're here to walk alongside. And children are great at asking really to the point question. Like we went camping this past weekend, and my 8-year-old was like, so like, are there 3 gods? Just kind of like out of nowhere. She's like, there's the Father, there's the Son, there's the Holy Spirit. And like, everybody's trying to figure out the Trinity, right?
Exactly.
But then you have an 8-year-old asking you that, like around the campfire, and you're like, well, let me tell you. So children will get to the heart of the matter, and they will ask the deep questions, and they will ask why somebody's sleeping on the side of the road, and why someone is sleeping in a tent in the city. They'll ask why this person doesn't have food. And I think that's really an opportunity to share with them, again, both the specifics of, this person doesn't have food because, let me stop right there. We should be careful not to make something up.
Right. You don't want to assume
describe a story to somebody. So I was like, wait a second, before we start down that road. So don't make up a story, but you can talk about systemic issues, right? Like, well, some people have experienced addiction. Some people, ended up in foster care, and they have a higher, obviously this is not how you explain to an 8-year-old, but like there's different pieces that you could string together, but to help develop like a posture of learning and listening, and that it's okay to ask questions, but it's also really important to show respect, right? So this person, even though you can tell is in a worse financial situation than you are, or worse physical health situation than you are, they're no less worthy of respect than an adult that you might run into at church or run into at the grocery store, right? And so you still don't call them by their first name, or whatever your family rules are around that. You still are super respectful, and then you can come ask me the question, and I will help you figure that out. And I'm learning too, right? So
Yeah.
kind of that posture of learning, I think, is one way that we do with our families. And then I think it's, again, different for every family, right? Like if your family has a history of poverty themselves, your instinct might actually be not to bring your children into those spaces,
Right.
because you've seen it and you've experienced it, and you're actually working to not have that trauma inflicted on your child.
Right.
And so I think there's room for parental discretion around what that looks like and what those conversations are, and so for a family who's faced poverty, or for a family who understands the racial dynamics of poverty in this country, where like wealth has been systemically allotted and encouraged and cultivated within the dominant culture, the white population in America, and there is disproportionate impact of poverty on folks of color. It could be really traumatizing for a child of color to go serve at a place where they can see that, like in San Francisco, like our Black population is only down to 4% for a variety of reasons. And yet the population of folks of color on the streets is in the 30%.
Wow.
And the percentages in the 30s. So that disproportion can also be extremely disheartening and requires a whole extra level of conversation, especially for parents of color. So I would say that, do what feels right to you, have the conversations that feel appropriate, and feel like they will encourage and disciple and challenge your child in the ways that are appropriate to your own family situation. I don't think there's one right way to do that.
That's good. That's really good. Sally, I could talk to you all day. There's all sorts of questions that I have going through my mind, but we're running out of time. So there's a couple of questions I'd like to ask at the end. One is, if you could give advice to your 21-year-old self, what would you go back and say to your 21-year-old self?
Oh, that's a quick question.
It's not quick, but it is a couple.
I think just trust the process, that life is not linear and there'll be surprises. And, when things get hard, just kind of keep pushing through and really be gracious to yourself. I think one of the best things I've learned over the years is that I can say to myself, you're doing the best you can.
Yeah.
And be okay with that. I think I was a lot harder on myself as a 21-year-old. And the anxiety can really creep up if you feel like perfection is the goal and the expectation. And so to just be gracious with yourself, to trust that God has a plan. Like, I didn't think I'd end up living in the Bay Area, an ordained minister, working at a nonprofit. Like, like none of those three things were on my list. And yet, here we are. And it's a gift. It's been a struggle and it's a huge gift.
That's good. Anything that you've been reading or watching that you could recommend?
What have I been reading? So let's see. Probably a couple of months ago, I read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. I thought that book was phenomenal.
Yeah.
It talks about the caste system in America specifically, and it compares Germany, America, and India in terms of their caste systems and their histories around race. And I just, I still think back on it. I found it fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's see. I try to alternate fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
And so I'm reading a nonfiction book now called Deacon King Kong, which is actually like a murder nonfiction. I wouldn't call it a murder mystery, but it takes place in the 60s. And it's just really, I don't know, a fun read, and it's interesting. I have been kind of shifting to read more authors of color in particular. I think I hadn't realized, again, as a person of color, just the normalization of even within my fiction reading, just like the white voice and the white perspective. And so I've really tried to broaden out my reading, and it's actually been so much less taxing to not encounter microaggressions in my casual reading. And so that's
Wow.
that's been a
Yeah.
learning curve for me actually during
Yeah.
COVID, where I've really shifted my bookshelf intentionally.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage people to try out some of these books and look at those lists on Amazon or on independent booksellers. I found a African American bookstore here in Oakland, and I haven't been able to physically go there, but I found them online. And just looking through their book recommendations and trying out new authors and new genres has been really powerful for me personally.
Yeah, that's great. Well, just to know, I did enjoy Deacon King Kong as well. I really,
Oh yeah.
I loved it.
Don't tell me the end. I'm not quite done yet.
I won't tell you the end. It's a good one.
Okay.
It's really good. Well, Sally, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it. I love the conversation, and we could go deeper and deeper. Maybe we can just have another conversation around a campfire sometime. That would be nice.
It'd be fun.
All right. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks.